Lori and our panelists this morning, I think, did a great job at setting the stage for this second panel, and we've got a great group of panelists representing both academia and industry, all bringing very different perspectives to the topic of this second panel, which is basically asking the question, how can technology help? Right, and so the context as we discussed it this morning, and I think this is one of those areas where there seems to be consensus, is that notice and choice in its current form doesn't seem to really be workable. Right? I think there seems to be a very strong consensus when it comes to that. Why? Well, we've discussed a number of reasons behind this. The policies are awfully long, they're awfully ambiguous, people are unwilling to read them, those who somehow are courageous enough to even try to read them still don't know what they've read. And then even if they were to read all these things, we're unfortunately human beings, and we're subject to all these cognitive and behavioral biases, and we're pretty hopeless. It's so easy to trick us and deceive us and get us to do all sorts of things that probably, in hindsight, we should not be doing, but nevertheless, you offer us the right coupon, and we fall for it. And so, given this context, and as we look forward and look already at the mobile web and the Internet of Things, you know, if you can't read a privacy policy on a website, what are the chances that you walk into a room like this one, where perhaps there are 20 different services and applications you're going to be interacting with that are going to be collecting data about you? What are the chances that a framework like this one could ever be made to work? And so the question we're going to be asking again this afternoon is, are there technologies out there that somehow could help make a difference, that could somehow empower users to regain control over their privacy in some sort of a meaningful manner? And so I will be the first panelist, and then I will go on, and in fact our panelists are well lined up. We just figured this out, they just sat this way, and then we realized they were exactly in the right order. And so I'd like to share with you for a few minutes some results of our research and tell you about how some of that research hopefully relates to this panel. So one of the themes that has been driving my research for many years is this concept of what I call personalized privacy assistance. And so what does that mean, and where does this fall into this overall picture? So by training, I'm actually a bad guy. I've been trained in AI, machine learning, data mining, all these words that this community tends to despise. And the question that I've been asking myself is, you know, we're trying to somehow, and I'm simplifying things a little bit here, so please give me a little room for a minute. So we're in some way trying to defeat these extremely powerful technologies, right, with legalese and with UIs that are sort of potentially very traditional in nature. And my take on this is that if you are going to try and match the power of these technologies, then you better start leveraging these technologies and so see to what extent you can get them to work for you. And that's, in a way, I think, one of the themes that has been underlying my work here. So I'd like to share with you a little bit of our research in a couple of different areas. One is in the context of mobile app privacy and how we've been able to leverage some of these AI and machine learning techniques with what I believe are promising results. We're not claiming by any stretch of the imagination that we've solved the problem, but we believe that we're seeing some glimmers of hope as part of the result that I'll share with you very briefly. And also some work combining natural language processing, crowdsourcing, and machine learning to try and see whether we can extract meaningful answers from these very obscure privacy policies that unfortunately many of us have actually taken time to read. And so when we look at mobile app privacy, as I think we all realize, many people have no idea, and this was already emphasized earlier this morning, many people have no idea about how much is being collected by these apps we download on our smartphones. In our early research, this was work together with Jason Hong and a PhD student of ours, Jialiu Lin, who is now working for Google. We looked at a number of different apps. Actually, we went all the way to downloading something like 100,000 apps from the Android Google Play Store and looked at what these apps were doing. And then we designed some protocols to show this to users and collect their reactions. And it was a lot of fun. So the sorts of things that you see here, and this is just a very quick display of the kinds of results that we collected in the early days, was reactions from users in terms of how surprised they were or not surprised by various types of data collection practices. And so, for instance, when you tell people that Facebook collects their location, that doesn't seem to be much of a surprise. They expect that because they know there's check-in functionality. The same thing when you tell them that Google Maps collect their location. There's no surprise there. And so those sorts of things tell us that, hey, when it comes to these very long privacy policies, perhaps there are things that people already expect. You don't need to necessarily bother emphasizing this so much. But there are other things that people are extremely surprised about. So there is this infamous app now, Brightest Flashlight. I'm sure some of you have heard about it. The FTC certainly spent some time looking at it very closely, as you might have, if you've read the news. And so Brightest Flashlight is one of these apps that turns on all the lights on your cell phone. And in order to do that, it requires access to your location and to your unique device ID, among other things, right? Obviously, we can see why this is needed. And when you tell users about this, you get very strong reactions, right? In fact, this was the biggest offender in our study. So 95% of people were pretty shocked. And many of them, when we asked them for full-length quotes, came up with language I wouldn't necessarily want to show on this slide. And so this triggered some follow-up to our research. So one of the things that we did is we used a set of techniques that people refer to as static analysis. So we, as I said, went ahead and downloaded a bunch of free apps, about 100,000 of them, and we decompiled them. They're very easy to decompile. This is, by and large, Java code, and you can write little scripts that look at this code and look in particular at third-party apps in the code. And these third-party apps tend to fall in various categories, such as social networks, marketing firms, advertising networks, and the like. And you can look at the APIs that these third-party libraries call. Effectively, if you see, for instance, an advertising network calling a location API, right, then you know that there's a good chance that this location will travel back to that advertising network. And now you know that, if Angry Bird is, calling, has this sort of code in it, it's not actually requiring a location because it needs it. It's requiring this location because it wants to send it to an advertising network. And so with my student, one of the things that we did is we looked at all these third-party libraries out there. And as it turns out, there's a relatively small number of them. Certainly if you focus on the main ones, there's something like 400 or 500 of them. And it's actually possible to organize them manually. And we did that, and we sort of found that it roughly fell into something like 9 different categories. And among those various categories, a few of them were of particular interest, targeted ads, SNS or social networking sites, and mobile analytics. And so we proceeded then to look at what's going on in terms of all this data collection that takes place through these free apps. And I thought I would share with you very quickly a couple of interesting results. So for instance, when looking, and these are stats from when we conducted this about a year ago now, when you look, for instance, at location, you might, I'm sure that many of you sort of expect that, but these are the stats for 100,000 apps. So when you're looking, for instance, at location, you find that when an app, a free app, requires your location, 17.5% of the time, that's for internal use. That means the app actually needs that to work. But 72.94% of the time, that's actually to share with an advertising network, and 26% of the time, this is to share with mobile analytics companies. And so those are the kinds of things that we're interested in. Why were we interested in that? Because our research, as it turns out, showed that people's privacy preferences are not just tied, as we all understand, I think, to what's being collected and what sorts of permissions an app requires, but also by what the app will actually do with that information that's being collected. And so one of the things we wanted to see is to what extent we could actually learn people's privacy preferences when it comes to their level of comfort sharing this sort of information with different kinds of apps. And so we started doing this at an aggregate level. So we basically conducted studies with about 1,000 users and collected their level of comfort in terms of sharing with different types of apps. And in this particular case, you're focusing on 6 different kinds of permissions: find location, course location, phone state, contacts list, SMS, and accounts. And differentiating between, again, advertising, internal use, which is basically the app needs it to work, advertising networks, analytics companies, and social networking sites. As you can tell here, there are some interesting patterns, right? So there are clearly things that people are not crazy about. Dark red means lack of comfort. So for instance, you get a minus. The scale is -2 to +2. And so +2 means extremely comfortable, and that would tend to result in very light shades of red, and very dark shades of red tend to be much closer to -2, and that means lack of comfort. So For instance, willingness to share contacts list, you get to a minus 0.97. That's something that by and large the population as a whole doesn't feel very comfortable with. But a constant challenge when we've been doing these sorts of studies, and we've done a lot of this stuff also in location privacy, for instance, earlier, is that this is not the right way to look at this. And so when you look a bit more closely at these things, and you look in particular at variance in these stats, which is depicted here with the various shades of yellow, the darker shades of yellow are basically indicating a very high variance, meaning that the population does not really agree on that. You find that, in fact, people are not all going to feel the same way about these things. So you look again, for instance, at contacts list, now you see a 2.3, which means that really, that impression that we got that people are not crazy about sharing their contacts list, well, that's not at least true across the board. There are people who've got different preferences when it comes to that. And so this has been, I think, a constant, and others have obviously developed. We talked about Westin earlier, so there are clearly a number of other people who've noticed that before. One size fits all doesn't work very well in privacy. This is one of the reasons why privacy is so challenging, especially when you move into contexts like mobile, where you have all these different scenarios to collect information about you, and you end up with operating systems like iOS, for instance, that offer you all these great settings. So on paper, you're in full control. You may have this illusion of control in a way, but in practice, this is absolutely unusable. I don't see people toggling their permissions on iOS, right, every day or every hour of the day based on where they are when it comes to their location, for instance. That just doesn't happen. So fortunately enough, this is where machine learning has something to offer. And so we've been looking at data mining techniques that are known as clustering techniques to see whether we could potentially classify people in groups of like-minded users. And so the question obviously is always, are you going to end up with 20 different categories of users, and are you going to have to ask people 50 questions before you can figure which category they belong in, or are you going to discover a relatively small number of categories, perhaps along the lines of what Westin came up with. And so as it turns out, and we've tried many different variations of these techniques over time, most of the time we come up with a very small number of clusters, a very small number of profiles, if you want. So in this case, for instance, we've been able to do extremely well just with 4 different groups of people. Now, very well doesn't mean 100%, but those are the kinds of results that we've been able to find. Be happy to share with you. We actually have a poster outside that gives a lot more information about these sorts of things. So you can actually, as it turns out, through a small number of questions, identify which profile is the best match for a person. And we've pushed this a bit further. So profiles by themselves will only get you so far. You might get perhaps 80% accuracy or so. And so that may not necessarily be something that you would feel comfortable with. But one of the things we've discovered is if you apply slightly more complex machine learning techniques, these sorts of things, and if you're willing to take more interactive approaches where you're not going to try to somehow predict everything that someone likes or doesn't like, which is truly impossible and clearly not compatible with the idea that we may change our mind over time. If you're working towards dialogues that are much more flexible, and this is where these concepts of assistance, I think, become much more meaningful, then you can actually start doing much, much better. So one of the things we've played with, this is actually with data that we obtained from LBE. It's one of those companies that has a jailbroken version of Android, where you can actually manipulate about 12 different permissions. And so this is based on data from hundreds of thousands of users, as it turns out. And we've been playing with trying to see to what extent we could predict the settings that they would feel comfortable with. And as it turns out, if you're willing to ask people something like 12 questions in this case, well, you can actually predict their settings with about 94% accuracy. Now, Alessandro, I can hear him already questioning these results. So the question is, okay, this is how people are configuring their phones, but should they really configure their phones the way they do? And if they knew better, is this still the way they would configure their phones? And so that's clearly a weakness in this approach. So our vision is not to stop there. Our vision instead is to develop these personalized privacy assistants, as we call them, and really the vision is one where you really want to stop annoying people. I don't want to be told, I don't want to have to deal with 100 different choices during the course of my day. I don't think that any approach that would require that much user involvement is ever going to work. And that's obviously one of the limitations of notice and choice today, right? As Laurie and Alicia have shown in the past, right? If you had to read all these privacy policies of all the websites that you interact with, you would be spending more than a month doing that every year. And so that's clearly unrealistic. So I think we need to aim for solutions where perhaps a couple of times a day, right, you're going to have some functionality that will have a pretty good sense for what you feel comfortable with and what you don't, and a sense also for what it doesn't necessarily know about you with enough certainty. And when it doesn't know enough about you, it might ask you a few questions. When it feels that perhaps you're not thinking about this right, it might nudge you. It might potentially provide you with a quick reminder, such as, did you know that during the course of the past 24 hours, right, there's a collection of apps that has collected your location about 37 times. Are you still sure you're feeling comfortable with this? Or would you like to look a bit more closely at your settings? So those are the levels of engagement that we're aiming for. So levels of personalization. Not everyone feels the same way, and I think we've got to recognize that. So it's not one size fits all. Certainly not everyone, in fact very few people I think are willing to devote an awful lot of time thinking about these privacy settings. So I think we need to move towards very different types of frameworks that have a better understanding for what you care about and are just going to focus on letting you know about those things and giving you choices about those things. So that's one of the things we're doing. I have one more slide and then I'm going to let my panelists speak because I think I've been speaking probably already for too long and I've not been checking my time, which is really bad. So I apologize to them already. So one of the other lines of work that we have going on is in a project called Usable Privacy Policy, the Usable Privacy Project. This is together with a number of people in this room, so Joel Reidenberg, Alicia McDonald, Laurie Craner, Alessandra Acquisti, as well as several people who are not in this room, Noah Smith, Travis Bro, and we have also postdocs and PhD students and others who are in this room. I can't name them all. Florian, please raise your hand. Actually, all of you who are in this project, raise your hand. It might actually be easier. No. So what is this project all about? Well, this project is, again, about taking a slightly different twist on the same approach, which is effectively, in the context of websites, could we somehow automate or semi-automate the process of understanding what's really meaningful in these privacy policies. And obviously, privacy policies are only part of what's going on. We all know about Ghostry and all these other efforts, which I think are extremely valuable and are very much complementary with what we're doing. But you would hope that somewhere in these privacy policies there might still be something meaningful. And so we've been asking ourselves to what extent we could combine crowdsourcing with machine learning and natural language processing to semi-automatically extract those key questions addressed in these very, very long privacy policies. And so obviously, if you look at it, based on research that has been done in the past by Laurie and Alicia, for instance, you would say that's a waste of time, right? We already know that people, even if you pay them to read these policies, they still don't understand them. And so the challenge in this project has been to see to what extent, using machine learning and natural language processing, we can simplify the task that we give to crowd workers, effectively focus on text fragments that are relevant to different kinds of questions, and instead of asking them to read an entire policy, we can get them to read perhaps one or two text fragments and answer a question for us. So we've been making good progress in this area, but we're very, very far from being able to claim victory in any manner. In the process, we're also looking at policy issues, because it's very clear that when you start crowdsourcing these things, you see very interesting results. You see there are questions that people actually have no problem answering. Questions, for instance, about the source of data that's being collected. That tends to be at a high level. For instance, if you ask, is there PII collected? Most of the time, crowd workers will be able to answer those kinds of questions very easily. But when you get into more complex issues of data sharing, for instance, you find that not only your crowd workers don't agree, but even law students, when you try to crowdsource things using law students, they disagree. You find that experts will disagree, right? And so that's obviously extremely challenging. The question is, how can technologies help make up for that in some manner? And at which point do you take these results and say, well, we've done the best we could do, and now it's time to have a little conversation with Congress and with the FTC, because really these policies, the way they're written, they're hopeless. Right, and so that's another side of this project, and so these are some of the things we're doing, and we're also developing plugins for browsers that are sort of aimed at communicating these very succinctly. So I've said way more than I should, and I'd like now at this stage to introduce our next speaker, who is Joanne Furtsch, who is coming from TRUSTe, and she's got a set of slides that I'm going to set up for her. So, okay. Joanne, please come forward. And I'm going to set you up.
Great. I want to cover kind of what some of the approaches TRUSTe has taken in looking at the challenges of providing effective notice and controls around exercising preferences, and a look into where we think that's evolving. So again, as everybody has talked about, the long-form privacy policy doesn't work, and that's why we were looking to develop solutions. And we really saw that this was amplified in the mobile space, where in 2010 we were seeing a lot of our clients, just pointing to their full-length privacy policy, which you can see here is next to impossible to read. And however, the full-length policy is necessary in terms of providing the basis by which alternative forms of notice are built upon. And however, they don't need to be the main interface by which a consumer would interact with a company's privacy policy notice. There's other ways to do that. Where we started with was how do you optimize privacy policy notice using icons? Using just icons themselves really didn't work. What we quickly realized in the beginning is that you need to have some words that are associated with those icons. And for mobile, what we did is we identified some key high-level categories that we thought would be important for consumers to understand from a privacy perspective, using testing through different user groups, and understanding exactly what is it that they want to know and enable them to be able to find that information quickly, and then drilling down to the next layer of here's what it means, what we're doing with location. And especially with location data on mobile, we felt it was just as important to state that we do not collect, as well as stating practices around collection. And we also felt having access to the full-length privacy policy was important to have that additional information available if somebody wants to look at it, and serve as that foundation for the upper notice, making sure that's consistent. However, one of the things that we are realizing with icons is that they are and sometimes binary, and it's hard to detect the nuances. And also, certain practices may not necessarily be able to be represented because it's not clearly disclosed in the full-length policy. And so the next evolution of our solution that we just announced this week is how do you make privacy statements usable and feed into a service? And so what TRUSTe's been doing over the past few years is reviewing privacy policies of the top websites as well as its own clients and building a database. So parsing out, does a privacy policy explain what are the expected uses of the data that a website or a mobile app collects? Does it parse out any unexpected uses, and is choice provided around that unexpected use? So we built this database. Right now it contains about 1,300 privacy policies that our team has parsed out, and that number is expected to continue growing. So what Disconnect Me did is develop a set of icons and a standard in how they define the icons, and we provide a feed into what that icon says. So whether a privacy statement has a certain statement, so making it the policy much more usable. The idea is similar to DLP technology that consumed enterprise IP policies as well as privacy policies. So this really drives the general need that there's a need for appliances to read consumer preferences, which is kind of the next stage of the evolution that we're looking at. Is like icons, sometimes preferences can be very binary, either it's yes or no, especially in the ad choices world where you can opt out of targeted advertising or to receive targeted ads. Challenge is you're still going to get ads. It's just whether you're going to get an ad that you might be interested in, or you're going to get an ad that has nothing to do with you at all. So we want to change that to discussion to give consumers more control around, this is, tell us what type of ad you want. It doesn't have to be the binary of non-targeted versus targeted. There can be that middle discussion to give consumers control around, well, I like travel. I'm interested in automobiles or food and drink. Give me ads that have that type of, that meets my interests. So over time, what we're thinking about is that these non-privacy policy control services and consent services are going to become more important. And is there room for a trusted third-party repository to collect and communicate these preferences throughout the ecosystem, so the consumer has a one-stop shop to indicate, here's what my privacy policies are, and then communicate that out to companies that they wish to engage with, and then the company communicates, well, here's our policy. Do those match, and is the consumer willing to provide an exception? So utilizing technology to do that and to communicate the policy throughout the chain, so it doesn't stop with the business, but it moves further down, so that policy goes with the consumer, whether that business is engaging with service providers, sub-processors, or third-party partners, that policy is communicated down the chain. And we're looking at this in the ad space, where under our Trusted Data Collection program, that's designed for third-party data collectors, that we require that the opt-out companies communicate that down through the ad chain and through their partners that they work with. Of course, the challenge comes around the real-time bidding space and how they are able to do that from a technological perspective. But the idea is that there should be some centralized repository around privacy or providing preferences, and we see some platforms have started to do this. Now it's how do we get them to talk to each other? And definitely would love to hear folks' thoughts around whether the idea of a trusted third party, is that possible in terms of getting your points of view, and whether that's feasible in terms of having that to manage consumer preferences and to communicate that out. Thank you.
So our next panelist is Maritza Johnson from Facebook.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to take my time today to talk about, kind of give you a little bit of a grounding in the way that Facebook thinks about privacy in general, which I think ties really well into two examples that I'm going to give of kind of new features or new little interactions that we're using on the site to, I think, get beyond kind of what we've typically thought of as notice and choice. And as I give each example, I want to talk through some motivation behind these changes and kind of give you an idea of what this has meant for the user experience. When we talk about privacy at Facebook, we really try to focus on these three principles. So we have knowledge. We want users to understand the product. We want them to understand the features that are available to them, know what their options are for managing their information, and have a true understanding of how they're interacting with the site. We also want control. So we want all of the people who use Facebook to be in control of their personal data, to understand how their information is being shared on the site, and then security, of course. So I'm not going to focus on security in today's talk, but if anybody has any questions related to security, I'll be happy to chat with you over any of the breaks. So one of the interesting things that we have when we look at what are people's key questions as they're interacting on Facebook, of course the top question on their mind is, this is a social network, and for all of the content they're sharing, they want to know, who am I sharing with? There's been a lot of research on this topic. Before I joined Facebook, I studied this topic at depth. It's a key question. I think this is at the top of most people's minds. They're looking at newsfeed, they're seeing all the content that's being shared with them, and when they're creating their own content, they want to know who's going to see this. And you can imagine, this relates directly to a lot of the topics that have been brought up earlier today already related to control and privacy as control. You want to have a way of managing your personal identity and managing who you're sharing with. So one of the key things that we introduced a couple years ago, up in the upper right-hand corner, is privacy shortcuts. And the first question here you see is, who can see my stuff? So through a lot of, user experience research and doing surveys and interviews and focus groups, we wanted to know, what are people's main questions when they're interacting with Facebook? And this was, of course, one of the main ones. So in addition to making this new change of introducing privacy shortcuts a couple years ago, more recently, I guess it was still maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we introduced inline audience control. So this was important where for every piece of content somebody chose to share on Facebook, they could choose the specific audience that they wanted to share with as they were posting. So this was an important step toward having, contextual decision that you are making at the point when you're actually creating and sharing content. So you can see here this little indicator down that says public with a drop-down menu so you could change the audience as you're making new posts. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is you, of course, want to know what it means when you're sharing to these different audiences. So if you're sharing to public, everybody, you want to know what that means. So we, through doing, user testing and kind of looking at, what are the key questions that people would have related to selecting their audience, we looked at, it could be, this would be the perfect time to remind people what public means. Yes, this information is available in the Help Center, and it's available at other areas in the site, but it's most useful when you're about to share to public. So here we had an additional tip for some users where it says, tip, sharing with public means anyone, not just the people you know, and they might see your post. And then you see your next choice is, if that's not who you want to be sharing with, then you can go and change that post's privacy. Some of you might have seen in recent months that we introduced another intervention that we've been calling the privacy checkup. And some of people have been kind of informally calling this the privacy dinosaur. And so to me, this is a really interesting intervention because, again, it gets to that moment in time when people are about to post a new status update. And it's very similar to that previous reminder, but with a different design. So here you have kind of this modal dialogue that pops up when you're about to post some new information. And it again reminds you, so you haven't changed your post lately, or you haven't changed who can see your post lately, just to remind you this is what public means, and then ask the question, who do you want to share your information with? So to me, kind of some interesting background on introducing this new privacy checkup, only the people who are posting publicly would see this intervention. And so you have some amount of targeting there. So not only is it contextual, but it's also based on actions that the user has taken in the past. And it also occurs only for people who hadn't changed their privacy in a while. So you can see there's a lot of background that goes into making the decision to introduce this new intervention here. So a lot of folks in the room, you've done research on looking at warnings, how do you best design interventions like this. So we know that we wouldn't want to show this dialogue every single time somebody posts. It would lose its effectiveness. And you also don't want to just show it to everybody. And you can't show a dialogue for every action and for everything throughout the site. So I think it's very important that, when these dialogues are being designed, there's an understanding of, what are users' biggest concerns? What are the questions that they have? What is the best time to introduce a message so that people can change their behavior? And then how do you give them, the right button so that they know what their choices are in that moment? So in addition to this question of who can see my information, a lot of people who use Facebook have questions around, why am I seeing this ad? Or they want to know, how, when you're looking through your newsfeed and you see these ads on the side, why exactly is this ad being targeted to me? And so a couple of weeks ago, we introduced a new tool where, again, focusing on this idea of we need to give people the information that they need in the context in which they would want to see this information. For every ad that you see on Facebook now, you can click on the upper right-hand corner and get this drop-down menu with this button that says, why am I seeing this? So depending on how you were targeted for this ad, you might see the DAA opt-out icon, ad choices icon, or you might see just a little information icon. But it's important that you could click on this and say, why am I seeing this? So in the example I've used here, I've seen this ad because Jasper's market is related to organic products, and based on the behavior that the pages that I've liked on Facebook and other information in my profile, organic produce is one of the interest groups that I'm in. So you can see down at the bottom it says organic produce, and then also tied to this one specific reason why I've been targeted, you can see that I can go through and view and manage my ad preferences. So then if I click on this, I can see kind of structured in a hierarchy the different interest groups that I could be targeted on, and I could see the ones that I've been targeted for. So here, this interface shows how I would be able to add preferences if I wanted to be targeted for additional material. But depending on which of these interest groups I was in, I would have a blue check mark like the one at the top on the different groups, where I could click on that checkbox and say, I no longer want to be targeted for World Cup. I'm tired of soccer ads. And there are a lot of other examples here. So those two examples are, I think, ways that we've looked at evolving this model of notice and choice, where, yes, of course, we have our data use policy, and yes, we have the statement of rights and responsibilities. There's a lot of great information in there, but when you're about to post a new status update, you're not going to, in the moment stop posting that and then go and visit the data use policy to check to see if there's relevant information there for you. So I think looking at these new interventions and looking at like the ads preferences tool, it's really important that you have this tied to what is the action that the user is doing and what is the context in which they're doing it, and how do you best introduce new information that's relevant then. So in addition to that, also building off of like the idea that knowledge is important and people should understand how to use the products, there are also a lot of pages that introduce different topics and kind of specifically how features work. But again, this is a great resource for people who want to like dig deep into one specific topic. I think you can see again how the earlier examples of having small dialogues with clear choices, there are pros and cons of each one, kind of different situations when you'd want to use either one. Is that?
So our next speaker is Sean Maguire from Microsoft. And just to rebalance things, our last speaker will be from academia. So let me see if I can get your slides. Perfect. Here we go.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I work in the Trustworthy Computing Group at Microsoft. It's a central group that focuses on the entire company, and traditionally it's been a lot about governance. So it's not just privacy, but we deal with accessibility, we deal with security, so we deal with all of the things that are really critical for our products to comply in the marketplace. We've been thinking a lot lately about what it also means for us to compete on some of these things that have had a traditionally compliance focus. And so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the models that some of the roles that we're using to engage people. And then my focus is actually more on the back-end systems. How do we start leveraging technology and binding policy into our technology systems? So for users, I think about a couple of different roles that we can play as a technology provider. So at some points, we can be a helpful lifeguard. For those of you in the room, you can see that Clippy is on the right. Clippy is neither helpful nor a lifeguard. Well, Clippy is a lifeguard if your lifeguard is swimming next to you and blowing the whistle the entire time that you are swimming, to the point where you'd like him to go away. So Clippy was an attempt to do this. It was an attempt to provide context-based information. The problem was systems weren't smart enough. We didn't have the machine learning, the AI, at our fingertips to make it actually useful to you in the context that you're working in. So Clippy kept saying, it looks like you're writing a letter. So, and Marissa just talked about the privacy checkup at Facebook. This is actually a very good example of a helpful lifeguard. Again, this is only showing up in certain contexts. When you're posting publicly, you've been posting public for a while, it's like, hey, maybe you want to take a look at this. But it's not reminding you every single time. It's not saying, hey, it looks like you're posting a letter publicly. So I think that the helpful lifeguard is a really important thing for us to think about in the usability aspect. And then the other one is really getting into the trusted assistant space. And this is somewhere that all the big companies are looking at now, and especially Microsoft with Windows Phone 8.1 is releasing Cortana, who is a personal assistant. And because to make Cortana really function, you need a lot of data behind her. You need a lot of information, and she requires a lot of data to actually make her useful to you. But it's one of these things where you could sign up for Cortana at the very beginning, and then Cortana has unfettered access to everything that you've ever done on any Microsoft site ever. But we chose not to go in this direction. There are some fundamental things that Cortana needs access to, just to be useful at all. You could just use her for search, but there are some additional things that she needs access to. And then there's a learning period over time as you actually interact with Cortana. She may post something that says, it looks like you have a flight going to Pittsburgh on Friday. And there's a link below that and it says, how do you know this? And it actually tells you, I was able, you gave me permission to do this. You can go read more about this, or you can actually revoke the permission at that point. Cortana also has a notebook. So we've taken the personal paradigm very seriously here. So it's not stored in some profile with arcane names that you don't necessarily understand. She keeps a notebook. And you can tell her things about you. You can give her what you want to be called, what your first name is. You can give her the name of your spouse. You can say, this is my home location. This is my work location. You can delete those if you want to. So you can go into the notebook. You can see what Cortana knows about you, what she might have inferred about you from data that you've given her access to, and you can interact with her. So it's more of an interaction with the system instead of a one time you can do whatever you want and good luck. So it's going to be really exciting to see Cortana hit the market and actually start seeing this in the wild more. So I've been playing around with Cortana. It's a very different approach than I've had with other interactive services that I've worked with before. But fundamentally, and this is what I worry about day to day in my job, everything underneath this is being powered by data. It's being powered by big data. And the problem that we see in our systems, not just at Microsoft, but I'm sure at every company, is that data tends to travel naked. We don't necessarily know where the data came from. We don't know what the policies are that are attached to that data. We don't necessarily know what privacy statement you agreed to. We don't necessarily know what setting you said, whether we could have your location or not. We may have that stored in one place, but if that data gets shared, maybe that information is not following with it. So what I'm working on is kind of the faithful representative role. And this is really for systems in the back end where we're thinking about a metadata-based architecture. So that data isn't traveling naked anymore, that policies are actually bound to the data as it travels in an ecosystem. We think about the metadata containing provenance, where it came from, potentially how it was sourced. In the past, pretty much it was declared data, but you can have inferred data. You can have generated data now. We have data that we have at Microsoft, but we also have agreements with third parties. We have integration points with Twitter and Facebook. So we need to know the data comes from there. And what we've discovered as we've looked at policy is that policy is very complex, and it gets very complex very quickly. If I were to take a picture of Lori's beautiful dress, I would have copyright over that picture, but Lori would have rights over where I could show that picture. Like if she would be able to say that I couldn't use that for commercial purposes. So right there are two parties that have rights on that piece of data. Let's say I upload it to OneDrive. Microsoft now has some rights on that data. I share it through another service. That service has rights on the data as well. So trying to make sure that we're faithfully representing the policies that are bound to the data is one of the things that we're looking at. And the user plays an important part in that as well, because it's not just the policies that Microsoft sets about use. We have a certain baseline of things that we say that we will and won't do with your data. It's really a series of promises that we make to you through our privacy statements, through our terms of use, and we have a baseline, but in each of our services and products, we give you additional dials and settings. If you don't want us to contact you through email or share your email address with third parties, we give you that option. If you don't want us to use your location in our Maps app, we give you that option. So we need to make sure that the policies are also representing the users in this as well. Now, we've thought about this from a usability point of view in terms of usability in actual big data systems. And we believe that metadata should be logically associated with the data. When we first started talking about this, we were saying metadata should be bound to the data, but computer scientists said if you start dealing with encryption, signing, all of that, your system's never going to work. It's going to fall it's going to fall to the wayside quickly. And so we understand that when you operate on data sets, likely the metadata will be separated from it, but you can make assertions that you're in a trusted container and the right things are happening within that container, and you can go so far as to audit or certify the containers that you're working in. And we know that there are a lot of policy languages out there. We are designing our architecture in a way that is policy language agnostic. So it's an interesting approach that we're looking at. We're building on research that many have done before us, and we are looking at this to really help power new experiences and make sure that people are not being lost in the shuffle, that their policies are being represented through the multiple parties, and that we're able to do this in a way that is flexible, still allows for data utility, and still allows for the users to not get lost in the big data shuffle. So there's more information available at the paper there, and please feel free to email me. I thank you for your time today.
So our next and last panelist is Sebastian Simic from Columbia University.
Yeah, I just
Fold that for you.
thanks.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just I do it later.
No?
It's
Okay, right.
Okay, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to make 2 points, and I actually will make them short. So first of all, the first point I want to mention is the question we try to answer is, can we leverage technology to help notice and choice? And I want to take a step back and say why that is useful, the motivation for that. And my answer to that question is that I don't perceive notice and choice as burdensome or a chore, but rather I see it as a chance for users and web services to actually fashion the privacy law in a way that meets their needs. And so I think this is something very special about notice and choice, and a point that makes it worthwhile working on notice and choice. Now, on the second point, can technology help leverage the notice and choice approach? And my answer to that would be sometimes and to some extent. There are clearly cases where notice and choice needs to go into a different direction. For example, it is not at all clear from a legal perspective what privacy policies actually mean. The Federal Trade Commission enforces them if they perceive that there is an unfair act or practice going on. But, for example, it is not clear whether a privacy policy creates a contract between a user and a web service. Most courts would probably say yes at this point, but this is something that has to be clarified on the legal side. And similar question is, for example, what happens if a privacy policy is silent on a particular matter? For example, there are provisions on the collection of data or the disclosure of data, but not on the use. So does that mean all users are allowed or only certain users? And to those kind of questions, obviously technology cannot provide an answer. However, in behavioral sciences and also social sciences, I think the perception is different. We can actually make improvements. And one of the projects we were working on at Columbia University, particularly with my advisor, Steve Bellovin, is how to take natural language privacy policies from websites like Facebook or others and try to apply machine learning just in the way, as Norman said before, in a way that is helpful for the users. So in the usual context, machine learning is perceived as a threat to privacy, but in that case, we can actually use it for the benefit of the user. And we developed a concept and a browser plugin for scanning these natural language privacy policies. And if everything goes right, I can show it to you. F7, okay.
There you go. Yeah.
All right, so I guess it's already out there. So this is just the natural language privacy policy of the New York Times. That's a regular Chrome browser with our extension installed. And if you click on this little P here in the corner, then it gives you a standardized label analyzing 6 different aspects of this privacy policy. And on top of these descriptions, there is an overall grade depending on the analysis. So in that case, New York Times received a B, which is average, and our grade range is from A to C. And as you can see, they collect information, they don't combine it with outside information, they do advertising tracking, and so on and so forth. So this analysis is based on a machine learning algorithm enhanced with a rule-based classifier. And a second element that we incorporated into our tool is crowdsourcing. So, for example, there is a repository called Terms of Service Didn't Read, and what they do is they collect information about privacy policies, so users can submit, for example, information about the Google privacy policy, and then they show this on their website. So our plugin goes first to this website and checks if we already have crowdsourcing results. If they are not available, then it does its own machine learning analysis. And so I can also demonstrate this for Facebook, because Facebook already has a Terms of Service Didn't Read label. And as you can see here, the policy is not yet graded, so the crowdsourcing has not led to a grade yet, which I think is because they require a certain amount of users to actually assign a grade. And so I think it just had not enough users. And it displays the information that the users entered. And now the reason why we chose this combination of crowdsourcing and machine learning is that we found that the analysis, the automatic analysis of privacy policies is limited by the ambiguity of language. So it's actually the same as with human readers of privacy policies. Both have the same problem. And so we think to overcome this problem, it is useful to use crowdsourcing because people can have a forum and a discussion of what certain terms mean. And therefore, we think it is helpful to make this combination of an automatic analysis and a crowdsourcing analysis. And that is all I wanted to say to this point. If you have any questions, please let me know afterwards. Thanks a lot.
I'd like to thank our panelists for some great presentations. I'd like to invite them now to sit in front of the audience, and I'd like to turn this into something that will hopefully be as interactive as the session we had earlier today. So I think we had a number of different technologies presented by our panelists, different views as to perhaps who should also deploy these technologies, limitations. Clearly, this is intended to tie into the panel that we had before on users and also prepare for the panel that we have later on. And so by all means, we don't want to view this as a bunch of silos. And so I'm sure that those of you with legal expertise might want to challenge some of the assumptions made by people like us, technologists, people who are focusing on the user might also want to challenge us, and other technologists in the room might question also the validity of the technologies or their limitations. And so we should have some interesting discussions. So is there anyone who would like to perhaps start? Yes, go ahead.
Sure. So I'm seeing a theme of machine learning plus crowdsourcing. And I was wondering if the panelists had sort of combined, your thoughts on these and how your methods differ and how maybe you could work together.
Yeah.
Well, so absolutely. So, for instance, in the context of collecting policies, even just collecting policies is actually not a trivial exercise. You'd think that all it takes is typing the URL/policy or privacy. It turns out to be more complex than that. So we've actually released the first body of policies over the web, and our intention is over time to release more things. And we think that even as we work on machine learning techniques, natural language processing techniques, our goal here is not, to be the only ones working on this. We'd like to challenge everyone in these various communities in NLP, in machine learning, to take a crack at this and see how far we can push these technologies. It's a very big design space when you look at this from even purely a technical standpoint. One of the things that we are playing with, and there are just so many different design options when you're trying to mix crowdsourcing, machine learning, and NLP, is how far can you go in automating these processes? How do you best decompose these tasks? So one of the things that I briefly touched on is the fact that you don't want to give your crowd workers entire policies and say, go at it and tell me what the answer to this question is, because we know that the results will be abysmal. How do you leverage the power of these larger groups of people to converge? So what are the questions? So the examples of questions that we're asking ourselves right now, we don't have answers to these questions, but hoping to get there at some level by the end of the summer, is when you compare, for instance, the performance of people who could be considered experts on understanding privacy policies with the performance of Amazon Turkers. How many Amazon Turkers do you need to have look at a given question to get an accuracy that's equivalent to that of experts? Are there signs that perhaps you're not going to converge with Amazon Turkers? Are there ways in which technologies can facilitate the crowdsourcing process, not just in terms of breaking things down, but perhaps in terms of limiting the number of options? Right? Are there ways of organizing crowdsourcing in multiple tiers where perhaps you bring in the experts on the really, really tough questions? And from a legal standpoint, what does it mean also when you have all these different people who cannot agree on what a policy means? How hard should you go at trying to solve that? Isn't the very fact that they can't agree an indication that perhaps there's something awfully wrong with this policy? And wouldn't it be okay perhaps, in your plugin to say, well, people are very confused on that one. It sounds like it's pretty ambiguous, and, draw your own conclusions. Or perhaps we can even draw the conclusions on their behalf, saying this is, and we can explain why and how, what is our process to reach that conclusion, right? When 10 Amazon Turkers cannot figure it out, then we consider that this policy is ambiguous and put the onus back on the policy owner to potentially clarify things if they're not happy with, the conclusion that we've reached. So many different, aspects to, and I think I've gone beyond your question in some ways, but perhaps Sebastian would like to add something?
I would add to these points that also crowdsourcing and machine learning is complementary in a way to each other. So, for example, crowdsourcing does not scale very well. This terms of service did not read repository that I just showed. I think they have about 150 privacy policies, and it does not look that they get, large number, and thousands or even more, and so that's an advantage of machine learning. You can use it on every privacy policy. Now, at the current state, the automatic analysis may not be quite as good. That's again an advantage of crowdsourcing. And I think to add a couple of more further research direction, I think what could be done in the future is to maybe send the automatic analysis results to the crowdsourcing repository, and then just people look at it and say, is that the correct analysis or not? And also the other way around, can you maybe feed these crowdsourcing results as training data into the machine learning analysis program? But that requires more checks on what is actually the correct analysis, because otherwise you train with the wrong data, or you give the impression that the results that you send from your machine learning to the crowdsourcing analysis are correct. And so there are many difficult questions to solve, I think. Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead. And feel free to disagree with us, by the way. So it's not meant to be. So we're not meant to be the only experts in the room. I think everyone in this room is just as much of an expert as we are. At least I'm speaking for myself. Maybe these guys are better experts, but I think there's a lot of value in having some meaningful conversation going back and forth.
So this may be more Facebook and Microsoft. So there comes a threshold or a point where your revenue model, how much is it impacted by privacy restrictions? Because you guys are running a business, right? And so more and more you fine tune and make it more closed user group. How much is it impacting your revenue? Because and what's your business model with your advertising and the e-commerce? The players, the vendor landscape, and how far can you go realistically? From a business point of view.
Would you like to start?
Sure, I can start. I mean, from Facebook's perspective, user trust is of utmost importance, and so I don't see that we really the dichotomy that you've set up is not necessarily kind of the way that we think about it. I mean, it's not at all how we think about it, actually. So I'm not really sure kind of exactly what your question is.
Well, so go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm just purely coming as a business owner, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the way my business runs, for example, is ad revenue, right? And e-commerce, how many users click the click-through, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at those numbers as your revenue model, and pretty much we are in business to make money, right? So if I'm looking at that, then I'm more and more, and it's given that it's a free resource given to the public, so they understand that, okay, so it's a give and take, no free lunch, right? So if that's the case, how much can you really hone down on the privacy settings? There's only so much you can go tighter, right? Without giving up your revenue. So where do you guys draw the line, metrics, your business model saying, what, here is all we can cross. Beyond this, we cannot afford any more privacy because it's touching our revenue model. So is there those kind of questions come to your surface? Or do you have those issues with your business unit? Say, you can do privacy to a certain extent.
I think from the Microsoft perspective, we have a very principled approach to privacy, and we use that to really guide our business decisions. We're also not completely driven by advertising. We have a very diverse portfolio of businesses, so we maybe have some more latitude than other companies, perhaps, but we have very strong debates at all levels in the company about where privacy is appropriate, and we don't feel like we're giving up any market share, giving up leaving any revenue on the table by taking the principled privacy approach that we have.
So when one of the tensions that I picked up in the various presentations we gave is that even though some of the functionality that we talked about, which I think amounted to some amount of automation, machine learning, sort of real-time, feedback to users, options to make decisions on the fly, and those kinds of things, I still perceived competition between at least two different models. One model where a large company, be it Facebook or Microsoft, tries to own the process and tries to effectively build the models for a user, and one where a third party might come in and try to do this for a user perhaps across all these different applications and services. And there's an interesting question, and obviously there are clearly business considerations. I can see how Google, Facebook, or Microsoft, given the very large ecosystem that they either control or are involved in, would potentially want to be at the center of that process, and can make lots of arguments for why it might be best placed to do that. and I can view how, I can also see how, as a customer, perhaps I might prefer to have a third party who is more disinterested and might also be able to get my profiles from Microsoft and essentially interpolate them in some manner so that they also apply to Facebook, because there's a very strong chance that the way I feel about sharing some information with Cortana is not terribly different from the sort of information I might be willing to share with Facebook. So I was wondering, whether you can share some of your insight into these tensions.
I think the tensions will always be there. I don't think they're ever going to go away. We ultimately want to provide the best experience for our customers, and for us it's a trustworthy experience. So we have partnerships with Facebook, we have partnerships with Twitter, we work closely with other companies to make sure that our customers are having good experiences and they're having safe, trustworthy experiences. So I think to your point about being the center of everything,
that's the business model, right?
I don't know that it is necessarily the business model. I think it is getting users to, clearly getting users to use your systems, love your systems, evangelize your systems for you, but compete at the same time, deal with the tension and do it in a respectful, trustworthy way. I think just by sucking up all the data and throwing privacy out the window would not be, it would fly in the face of what we've done at Microsoft. It would fly in the face of the principles that we've stood for. So, but that tension will always be there. And I think that it's understanding what is right for us as a company and what we can do to make sure that we are respecting our customers.
Would you like to say something? Nobody else? Or you don't have to. I was hoping that would create a bit of a debate. We can move on to the next question. There's somebody in the back. Yes, go ahead. I was actually pointing to you, so. To you?
Me?
Yes.
Okay, I have a burning question for Maritza. Why a dinosaur?
That's a challenging one.
We have, throughout some of our new user experiences for new products, we've used like a bunny in some cases. We have a little monster that we've used. So it's just one of our little icons. I think this one was particularly cute. So in some of the images you'll see he's like typing on a computer. We might have one where he's using a phone.
So is this because you're going after the younger generations?
Maybe.
So we had a question from Pedro in the back. Yes.
So first a quick comment regarding the new feature that Facebook just introduced. I think it's really nice that you are using a different phrase, not ad choices, but why did I seeing this? When I did a study a couple of years ago, I actually found out that people were understanding much better what that item was when the phrase was, why did I get this? Which is very similar to what you're using. So I'm very glad to see that you are actually taking into account what users actually expect from that kind of notice. But my question really is about this idea that privacy is contextual. Privacy policies are really hard. It's really difficult to capture context in a simple privacy policy. So I want to know what Microsoft's perspective is with the idea of data dashboards. How data dashboards can be used to enhance people's privacy.
So we actually do have a personal data dashboard that's in beta right now off, I believe it's choices.microsoft.com, I'd have to look, where it provided some of the feedback about the categories of advertising that you would see. It would also contain opt-out information if you wanted to correct it. We see dashboards as one really good way to engage people, and so I think going forward we're continuously evolving how we think about our products and services, and I can't comment on any future plans at the moment, but dashboards are somewhere where we have invested, and I'm sure we will continue to invest.
I'd like to remind our panelists that we only have 3 microphones for the 4 of them. And I'm thinking that maybe Joanne was not able to respond because she just didn't have a microphone. Is there something that you want to say?
I just want to make a couple of points. To one of the earlier questions that was first discussed around the machine-readable privacy policies. TRUSTe, with its privacy policy database, one of the things that we did build into our process is if there's a question or a comment about how a disconnect me icon is being served based upon the information that we're providing, we do have a mechanism to take in that feedback, as well as if there isn't a privacy policy present, all the icons show up gray because there's no policy there. We also have a mechanism to request addition of privacy policies. And then just to the dashboard discussion, I think raise a really key point is around access, being able to re-access a preference and to update that, because they do change over time. And that's one of the things we did with our trusted interests solutions. We wanted to make sure that consumers can re-access those preferences, because you don't always want automobile ads. You do at some point buy the car. And so you may be interested now in travel because you got this shiny brand new car to go places in. So I think access is also a key part of this discussion around being able to exercise your preference.
So we had at least one question from Serge in the back, and then we're going to move forward.
Yeah, since I guess multiple people have talked about third-party labeling of privacy policies, such as the crowdsourcing, machine learning, and I was wondering if you really see that as sustainable when you think about the liability issues involved. Mm-hmm. So if you're relying on random people to explain how data on this site might be used, then that might open, if they're incorrect, then it might open them up to maybe a liable lawsuit.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And one of the things that we thought about was that very question, because privacy policies and practices change over time. So part of what we're looking at is how do we keep those up to date and keep that data relevant and maintain the integrity of the database and the information.
It's not just up to date, but it's also, correct.
Yes, and that's why we built that in, those mechanisms to be able to make those corrections and get that feedback. And I think that's why it's a combination of multiple methodologies to populate that database and put that information out there in a service format.
What we also envision is simply disclaimers that explain how that data was obtained, how did we reach these conclusions, and make it very clear that inherent in the process there is the possibility that some conclusions are wrong. You could also give owners of privacy policies the option of correcting things, which you would hopefully want to make and manage to make legally binding in some process, and then they would have the decision to make as to whether or not they want to correct things or leave them as they are, and potentially be able to point to all the inaccuracies at some point later on. I think there are various ways in potentially dealing with that. I think there's a question from Ian in the back, but there was a question from you, right, first.
I'm not sure. Okay, it's working. So I'm going to riff on your question from the very beginning. I kind of noticed that there was a theme where you were talking about translating privacy policies and TOUs into more simplified forms. And it asks that the user anticipate the effects. And my analogy for this, I told this to Norman last night, is that it's sort of like if I asked you to tell me right now how you're going to spend all the money you ever get for the rest of your life, but tell me now how that's going to work. And money's easier than personal data. And we can't do that. And even the folks in this room can't really anticipate the effects of all this stuff, whether it's complicated or simplified. So I'm wondering if you've considered the possibility of asking for crowdsourcing or experts or third parties to anticipate the effects for us, the individuals, and kind of along the lines of consumer reports. So consumer reports, not only do they tell me that there's a feature on some product that they're evaluating, but they also tell me the effects. And then I can evaluate. And I never have to read the 60-page warranty, which is kind of like the privacy policy in the TOU. I don't want to read the warranty. I just want that little simple line of dots. And I'm wondering if you would consider something like that.
So
I just wanted, this is on by the way?
Yes.
Okay. So I just wanted to say that I think if, for example, what I demonstrated before in this browser extension, I think that level of detail is actually too much for the average user, because we have to update our software and deal with security issues and antivirus and privacy and so on and so forth, and that all takes time. And so I think it's exactly what you said. We need a short and very fast label or icon or something similar, and one way to do that is to use grading. And we have, in order to show that we have a secure connection, we have this little green HTTPS log in the browser. Maybe we could do something similar for privacy. And obviously, as you said, it must be ensured that this is the correct classification of the policy, and also forward going, that it is a sufficient consideration of what the privacy policy actually means. But I think that is a very difficult thing to achieve.
I think we're also rediscovering results that others have already found earlier. So I know from my conversations with Lori that with Privacy Finder, one of the motivations was that just rating, for instance, privacy sites and privacy policies by itself is not necessarily going to be sufficient. So if you tell people this site is a D-, right, that might be horrible, but unless you give them an alternative, if you give them an actionable alternative, they're not necessarily going to do very much about it. And so I think that as part of our work, and I'm sure that Sebastian is thinking about this in a very similar manner, the idea would be to see, could we find equivalent websites that perhaps don't have as bad a grade, or perhaps even personalize that in some manner. So if I know the kinds of things that you care about, right, your grade might actually be different, and I might be able to zoom in on a different site that doesn't have that issue. If I could tell you about it right away, make this something that's just one click away, then I can see these things having more of an impact than if you just tell them this is terrible, but you have no other option.
So I might have misunderstood your question, but I think the biggest thing that's preventing kind of this ability to say in the notice like what the effect would be is, I feel like as a community we're still grappling, even folks in this room, and figuring out what the actual harms might be, and figuring out like how do you then map those to an individual, to the context, and kind of personalize it such that they could use that in their decision-making process. So I feel like one, we kind of have only a loose understanding of the potential harms, and then two, this idea of then personalizing it. I think we're pretty far off from being able to do that right now. So like in a lot of these new features that are introduced on Facebook and other sites and companies as well, it's easy to kind of make a clear sell for like the value proposition, and you give controls and you want people to make their own decisions and kind of choose for themselves what's appropriate. But it would be, tough to kind of make that right pairing to then what the positive and negative effects might be. I think that's a conversation that we're all still having. What are the potential harms?
And I think to your point about consumer reports, I think the stakes are just different in that case. I like the concept. I love the concept of the consumers union, which is an independent entity that doesn't take advertising, that is able to go out, buy these products, test them, and come up with a grade for them. But there's a financial incentive for them to do that, and there are financial incentives for people to sign up for that service. And so, if you're spending $1,000 on a refrigerator, or $2,000 on a washer and dryer, or $13,000 on a car, there's a reason for you to sign up for a subscription, whereas, especially in privacy, when you're dealing with ad-supported sites that are free, the barrier to entry is very low, and your risk, correctly or not, seems to be less. Because, well, I don't like Gmail, I'm going to go to Outlook.com, or I'm going to go to Yahoo Mail, or other services just may not exist. I mean, honestly, Facebook is the biggest social network on the planet. So if you want to connect with the most people, you need to go to Facebook. And so I think if regulators wanted to stand something up, but I think the financial incentive is not there yet, unfortunately.
So in the back, Ian?
I'm curious, when we talk about automatically understanding or rewriting privacy policy to either fit a standard template or be more readable in a standardized way, it seems like we do lose some of the nuance there. Like, you have a large company, be it Microsoft, Facebook, Google, whomever, different parts of the service operate in different ways. You might have an ad service that might give something to a third-party advertiser, but then we might have an email service where that's totally sacred and we're never going to give that. And how we convey that nuance in something where you're getting distilled into the site shares data with a third party, yes or no, seems like a difficult question to me.
It's absolutely a difficult question, and I think it's very clear to us that technology will not be the ultimate solution. Technology will be a component, but people and policy are going to be at the basis of this. So we're hoping initially that technology can help solve some of the easier things that are very, very clear. It can take care of the types of use questions and give answers back because the policy is very clear. It's very well understood, and maybe it's implemented the exact same way across Microsoft. But your point is very well taken that our advertising policies will likely be different from our Office 365 policies. And we as a company need to get all the smart people together in a room and figure out, of the things that we would like to automate, what can we automate, and the rest that we need to leave up to people. And we need to, as long as people are in the equation, users and the people developing the software, we're going to have this complexity.
I would say, however, I would say number one, that some nuances matter to users or consumers and others don't. And so it would be interesting if we could somehow limit ourselves to those that actually matter to people. That clearly has to be informed by user modeling and building deeper models of how users think about these scenarios, many of which are completely new, and so it's obviously a challenge for the research to be done before you actually launch these services. The other thing I wanted to say is that if the number of nuances that matter to users remains large, and users are left having to figure out how they feel about these things on their own, then I think we've got a major problem, and that's perhaps where the next panel might come into play and offer some solutions, because there might be some scenarios, if there are just too many of these scenarios and users have to evaluate them one at a time, each time, and technology somehow cannot come up with meaningful conclusions. I believe that technology can come up with meaningful conclusions. Certainly our work in privacy preference modeling suggests there are very strong correlations between the way you feel about a few things and a bunch of other things. And so you could potentially rely on these things, on these models, to infer how people are likely to feel about some of these nuances. But there might also be limits, and I think that's if there are such limits, and this is beyond what users are capable of doing, beyond the amount of time they're willing to devote, then that's, I think, a pretty strong argument for saying, well, in that case, somehow there's got to be some kind of a regulatory framework that's going to limit the imposition on users, that's going to provide them with a modicum of protection so that they're not left basically out in the cold. Ooh, maybe that was the last statement from this panel. All right, so, well, thank you for agreeing. Let's leave it at that. So I think we've reached the end of our panel here. I want to thank our great panelists one more time.